This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by OWC, Carl Tatz Design, Jay-Z Microphones, Spectra 1964, and Isotope. You're hearing my voice right now through the Jay-Z pop filter on the Jay-Z BB29 microphone in a Carl Tatz designed room through the Spectra 1964 STX 600 mic pre-complimenter and Isotope RX and Ozone, all recorded safely onto an OWC Mercury Extreme Pro 6G SSD. So get ready to rock.
Well, to a great extent, it was working with people who had been my mentors and whose music I loved. Like one of the records I loved when I was a kid, I loved a band called Hank Ballard and the Midnighters, who made great records. And, Hank Ballard wrote The Twist, but he wrote a lot of great songs. And then one day I walk in and I'm making a record with Hank Ballard.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. No matter where you like to rock in the galaxy, the OWC Envoy Pro Electron lets you record with confidence over USB-C with up to more than a gigabyte per second of real-world performance. Transfer tracks in seconds and take your sessions with you anywhere you go. Built for reliability, the OWC Envoy Pro Electron is waterproof, dustproof, and crushproof. Find the Envoy Pro Electron and all your OWC storage needs at macsales.com/rockstars. I used to have an expensive pop filter for my vocal mic that was so fragile, I had to put a sign on it warning singers not to touch it or else the thing would break. But not anymore. Now I've got this super durable pop filter from jzmic.com that sounds fantastic. I don't have to worry about stuff breaking and can focus on making music. Go ahead, grab my pop filter. I dare you. Use the limited time coupon ROCKSTARS and get 20% off the amazing pop filter at jzmic.com. Howdy, Rockstar. Are you ready to discover the secrets to making your mixes sound professional no matter what your studio situation? Then check out my free mixing course, mixmasterbundle.com, where I show you how to get pro-sounding mixes in your DAW using simple techniques and free plugins. And when you're ready for more advanced studio skills, then check out Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can learn from Grammy-winning teachers to help you record, edit, mix, and master your best record ever. Use the code ROCKSTAR for 10% off for a limited time. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Geoff Daking, who grew up playing in local bands before attending American University, where he ultimately left to join the New York-based Mercury artist Blues Magoos to play drums in 1966. Between 66 and 69, they recorded 4 albums, 2 of which were platinum, and a top 5 single, We Ain't Got Nothin Yet. The peak of their career was in 1967 when they toured 4 months with Herman's Hermits and The Who. And during that tour, the Hermits were actually the headliners. During that time, Geoff became fascinated with recording and engineering some of the Magoos' last album. In the summer of 69, he went back to Woodstock, where he played in bands with Tim Harden, Dave Sanborn, Paul Butterfield, and Buzzy Feiton. Feiton. Okay, thank you. Thanks for the correction. In 1970, Geoff became a staff engineer at Sound Ideas in New York City, then SoundMixers, and later as an independent engineer. And in 1982, he opened his own studio, Nimbus Nine, which grew to 4 rooms with 1 API, 1 Neve, 1 Trident, and a ProTools setup. Since 1970, Geoff has designed and built more than 20 recording studios for music, film, and commercial production, including the all-analog Big Blue in Katona, New York for the recording of Joan Osborne's premiere album, Relish, and Tuxedo Park for Cyndi Lauper's Sisters of Avalon. His most recent studio is the multi-million-dollar music production facility in St. Petersburg, Florida, Big 3 Entertainment. And in 93, Geoff started manufacturing his own line of audio equipment. The first product was a combination mic pre and EQ. This all-discrete Class A unit was based on the legendary Trident A-range circuits by Barry Porter. Next was the FET compressor, and in 2000, production began for a full-size Class A recording console in frame sizes from 16 all the way to 80 inputs. That's a lot of inputs. Thank you so much to William Whitman, a previous guest on the show, for making our introduction. Thanks, William. Please welcome Geoff Daking to Recording Studio Rockstars. Geoff, are you ready to rock?
I am ready.
All right, man. Thanks for joining us. And that was a pretty awesome introduction for you. You have done a lot of things, and it's great to have you here on the show.
Well, you got to change your career every 7 years, I think.
Is that the magic number?
I don't know. I was a recording engineer for 25 years or 27 years. And then I was just looking today, somebody asked me to service one of their units that I made in 1994. So that's 27 years ago, right?
Wow. Well, I think it was in the 90s when I first saw your gear in the studio, making records myself. Yeah.
1994.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more in your own words about the start for you. Certainly we'd love to hear about the Blues Magoos. You guys had made some pretty cool sounding records.
Well, we recorded in New York, started off at Mercury Studios, which was 3-track. And then we went to Regent Sound, and that was 4-track, and then later 8-track. But that's where I got interested in recording. And I left the band in June of '69, and I went back to Woodstock, and I had this wacky idea of building a recording studio in Woodstock. And I was trying to get funds to do that. And I went to the AES show in 1969, and I met the guys from API. And they had the very first production API console there, which was sold to a guy named George Claiborne at Sound Ideas. So I went to visit him in January. And he was a guy who hadn't been very busy, and I just hit him on a busy week. And he said, "You want a job?" I said, "Sure." Of course, he didn't know that I didn't know anything. So that was interesting. The very first day I did a commercial for TWA Airlines. The song was Up, Up and Away. And it was the room was filled with the most famous Brazilian musicians who ever lived in New York. So I had, took me a few years to really get it worked out. I think it always takes 5 years of constant work at something before you really feel comfortable doing it.
Yeah. I mean, what did you ever think of that whole 10,000 hour concept that floats around for, becoming a master at anything?
I don't know how many years, 10,000 hours. I think it's about the same, isn't it?
I think it is. I think it is somewhere in the vicinity of 5 years.
That's about how many hours you have to have before you crap in your pants when you have 40 musicians in front of you.
Wait, so you crap in your pants when you start, and then 5 years later you don't any longer, or you still do? That's
it. No, hopefully no longer.
Yeah, because that would be a smelly studio for sure. Speaking of which, sense of humor, listening to the Blues Magoos records, you guys clearly had a sense of humor in some of your music, didn't you?
Yes, we did. It was a fun time, and we made some interesting. We tried to make music that was more interesting than some of the other stuff that was out at the time, and it was a Greenwich Village experience. We were playing at the Night Owl in Greenwich Village, and we were playing there with the Magicians, who were Alan Gordon and Gary Bonner, who wrote Happy Together, and Jimi Hendrix was around the corner in the Cafe Wah, and the Fugs were in the theater, and the Mothers of Invention were around the corner, and Jose Feliciano and the Blues Project and Tim Harden and just about anybody you could name. It was a really ripe environment for music.
An awesome time.
Oh, yeah.
Rockstars, we've got a playlist, of course, of Geoff's work in the show notes, so you can listen to records on Spotify, but then also we put together a YouTube playlist, including some of these commercials. I think you got like a Pepsi commercial and a Coke and American Airlines, but you did a really hilarious one too with Mel Brooks. Okay, so
in the years that I started off in the recording, but this is so much different than now. I was a staff engineer. So in those days, studios had a sound, and the sound was partly the studio, and it was partly the engineer. So you went to Philadelphia to do the sound of Philadelphia. You went to A&R to try and get the sound of Phil Ramone. You went to media sound to get this. So at any rate, everybody is now an independent engineer. I don't think there really are studios any longer that have staff engineers. However, when you're a staff engineer, you really never know what you're going to do. For instance, one day I have Donny Hathaway, and the next day I'm doing a commercial for American Airlines. But the thing you're referencing was on a Friday afternoon in New York in the summer. It was nothing going on in the studio. It was about 4:30. I was about to go home, and they said, "Oh, we have a demo for you to do." The studio SoundMixers parent company was a company called Sound One, who at the time were the largest audio for post-production company in New York. And Mel Brooks walks into the studio, and we record the song "Jews in Space."
That's great.
I mean, you just never knew what you were going to do. For instance, my first assignment at SoundMixers that essentially hired me for this was to do Lou Reed. And that was a very interesting record because Lou didn't want anyone else in the room or any assistants. So it was just Lou and me in the studio for months.
Wow.
7 p.m. to about 4 a.m. every day for months.
I don't know if I put that one in the playlist yet. What record?
Well, it isn't in the playlist. And the reason is the record was called Street Hassle. And it had songs like "I Want to Be Black." "I don't want to be a fucked up middle-class college student no more. I just want to have a stable of foxy little whores. I want to be like Martin Luther King and get shot in the spring and fuck up the Jews." So anyway, we do this whole record, we mix it, and Clive and the Minions come in, for the little wine and cheese to listen to the record party. And we play the whole thing, and Clive stands up and says, "Lou, this album is relentlessly offensive." And that was the end of it. Wow. And of course it was my fault. Lou never spoke to me again. It was my fault that Clive didn't like it.
Wow, what a story. That's intense. After months of work, too.
Yeah, including being through the blackout in New York. The big blackout in, what was that, 77?
Wow.
Which was funny because SoundMixers, when it was being constructed, was a very large facility. It was the entire second floor of the Brill Building, which we consider to be Tin Pan Alley. And they made the very poor choice of building it with non-union electrical workers. And so as the studio was just about to open, Local 3, the electrical people, came in and held the maintenance guy at gunpoint, and they smashed all the consoles and cut all the audio wires.
Whoa, so smashed all the consoles?
All the consoles, smashed all the consoles with sledgehammers.
Good Lord.
So a few months later, they got the place going again, but we had an armed guard. We had a guy named Victor who sat at the front desk with his 38 on the desk. And I think one room was done, and Lou and I were working in one room, and then another room was done, but there wasn't really much going on at night. So as the power went out and the machine, of course we thought we were under attack. So Victor is out lying on the in the lobby on the floor with his gun drawn, and Lou is just in apoplexy. But it was fine. We all got out of there, and we came back on, I guess that was Monday.
Was it typical to record a record for months like that?
Well, yes. As it is now, this was a record that he had started doing binaural recording with the Sennheiser head.
Wow.
And he was doing the whole thing binaurally. It was just a long thing. But yes, months. It takes months to make a record in the late 70s.
With so many game-changing iZotope plugins to choose from, deciding which one to buy next could be a bit of a challenge. But did you know that now you can have all their plugins through iZotope's new affordable subscription bundle, Music Production Suite Pro, for only $19.99 per month? Get your Rockstar extended 30-day free trial subscription now at iZotope.com/rockstars and use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off any individual plugin purchase. Do you need to record direct stereo keyboards? Spectra 1964 now offers the Stereo BBDI-2 with custom wound high-Z transformers for big headroom, virtually flat response, and a 15 dB input pad. The Spectra 1964 BBDI passive direct box is also perfect for recording deep bass that will make your mixes sound huge. Plug that into a C610 comp limiter, and as founder Bill Cheney points out, it'll move your pant leg. Get your sound moving at Spectra1964.com. What about when you were doing some of the early ones? So with the Blues Magoos, you were playing drums, right?
Right.
What do you have any memories or any stories you enjoyed sharing from that time? I mean, you guys did Electric Comic Book, Psychedelic Revival.
Psychedelic Lollipop, that Revival thing was decades later.
Okay, great.
I thoroughly enjoyed recording. You know, it was another thing. It was a commercial studio where we went in at night when all the whatever they were doing during the day was over, and we went in at night with a guy named Art Palhemus was the engineer, and we made those records, and they took months.
Do you remember having a sense of how complex it was to record back then? Was it fairly simple, and it was a lot of focus on the music? Or was there some complexity to the engineering of it as well?
Well, when we went to Regent Sound, the console there was basically a radio board, and I would say it had 8 inputs, and it was going to first going to 3 and then to 4-track, and you had a console with no EQ or compression, and you had a couple of equalizers. I remember there was a couple of Pultecs and an Altec graphic equalizer, and I think there was a Fairchild in the control room.
A Fairchild compressor or EQ?
Yeah. No, compressor.
Oh.
And that was about it.
That's not bad if you're going to have one.
Well, there you go. They had Fairchilds, and they had a mastering room too, and it was only mono, but they had mono Fairchilds there.
Yeah, and thinking about that sort of pre-compression time of recording too, I think sometimes with modern mixing and recording and loud records, we take for granted compression as something that like, oh, you have a compressor and you use it to make music loud. But at that point, nobody had sort of discovered that a compressor could really make something and sound massively in your face.
Well, there's tape.
Right, tape had that built into it.
Yeah. Well, we did the Joan Osborne record in 1994. This was another thing where they wanted to do it out in the country, away from everything. And so one of the things Rick Chertoff, the producer, said he didn't want to have an assistant engineer hanging around. He said they wanted to manage all the tapes themselves. Well, of course, that was a stupid idea because, nobody's going to manage all the tapes from a multi-track album session. I mean, you could have 40 reels of tape. So we came up with a scheme where I had a Studer 827, and we had 14-inch reels running at 15 IPS. So if you're running a 10-inch reel, 30 IPS, you get 16 minutes.
Right. Which
means you really only get, 12 minutes, because who's going to start a take in the last 4 minutes of the roll and risk running it?
I always wondered about that, and like who came up with that length of tape,
So then if you go to 15 IPS, you get 32 minutes on a 10-inch reel. Well, that's better. However, if you go to a 14-inch reel, you get 64 minutes. So there's virtually no waste at all. And so what they did was they would record a song, and if they didn't like the take, they'd go back and erase it. Maybe they kept a couple of tapes. And I think we did that album in 3 reels.
Wow.
3 2-inch reels. Big-ass 2-inch reels, but that was what it was done in. And it was also recorded. Now, this got me off my track here. We're talking about tape compression.
Right.
That was recorded at +9 over 200 nanowebers. What's that? 520 nanowebers,
which was super hot back then, right?
Super hot, and at 15 IPS. So if you listen to that record and you hear the snare drum compressing, that's the tape.
Wow.
456. One of the greatest tapes ever for compression.
I totally agree. I always loved the sound of 456. We had the luxury of doing a record and the ability to try a whole bunch of different tapes and speeds and decide which one we liked the best. And we just love 456 at 15 IPS.
Yep.
It's just got a great mid-range crunch that makes it sound like rock and roll.
Yes, it does.
Right on. So then you guys went on a big 4-month tour. Any fun stories from that? And anything from playing with Herman's Hermits and The Who?
Oh boy. Well, I was there. I was there for the infamous Keith Moon's 21st birthday party, where he managed to hit 2 Michigan State policemen in the face with a sheet cake, and then
good Lord,
a bunch of things ended up in the pool, and then he tripped and fell and broke his teeth and had to stay in Flint, Michigan the next day to have his teeth capped. But again, remember, this is long before the internet, but we were staying at Holiday Inns. Holiday Inns had a network called the Holodex machine, which was basically a teletype. And they went out on the Holiday Inn system and had us banned from every Holiday Inn. So we show up in Philadelphia the next day. And they won't let us in the hotel. Now you got like 45 people, the bands and a couple of roadies and all these people standing on the curb in Philadelphia, waiting to get in. And I shouldn't probably be proud to say that I'm the guy who told Keith Moon not to put the cherry bombs in the toilet.
Oh boy, that's a quote. That's worth starting the podcast for right there. That's great.
Yeah, that was a great tour.
I feel like my gut tells me that some of the things I saw in Spinal Tap may have come from stories of those times. That in the 70s as well. I
think Spinal Tap was actually based on Savoy Brown.
Oh yeah? I don't know anything about Savoy Brown.
It's pretty much like Spinal Tap, I think.
That's awesome. How are we not going to fit? Well, how many people was it in a King Leisure?
Yeah.
All right, so let's keep talking about the studios back then a little bit, if you want to. I mean, what were some of the things that were exciting about the changes in studios in those maybe in that first decade of recording? Things that came along was the multi-track tape machines, right?
Well, the first big excitement was going to 8-track, where you could really do a lot of things because you could cut. See, when you're cutting in 3-track or 4-track, you probably put the entire rhythm section, or at least the drums and bass, on one track, and maybe the guitars another. Then you keep 2 others that you bounce back and forth for vocals and overdubs. Once you get to 8-track, you could compartmentalize things better. You could have much more control over mixing and replacing things. I mean, if you cut the bass and drums together, you want to replace a bass note. Well, you're just out of luck, aren't you?
Yeah. Well, today, of course, we struggle with the concept of why we run the risk of putting off decisions which should be made in the moment. Did you guys have a sense of that? Did you ever feel like, people are just putting off decisions now that they got 8 tracks when they should have made them going down to 3? Or was it just clearly a good idea to have a little bit more multi-track control?
It's interesting. I built a big console recently for some people in Florida. And it's a 48 input console, and they have 48 channels of Pro Tools, but they bought a 2-inch machine. And he called me up and he said, so what's really the difference between digital recording and recording in analog? And I said, planning. Because you got a 24-track, probably have some sort of time code on one channel, so it's 23 tracks. So you don't have the luxury of just continually doing things. So, for instance, in a session like that, you would basically know what you were going to record the first day, whether it was drums and bass, maybe a couple of guitars and a keyboard or something like that. And you would lay those things out in a way. And then if you knew that there were going to be just vocals, you might do something else. If you knew that you had to do horns and strings, then that would be something else. And you constantly had to keep thinking of ways to get it all on tape without running out of tracks. So of course, that's not true anymore. You can have 932 tracks.
Right.
Unlabeled.
Yeah, unlabeled. All audio 1 through audio 932.
Right, all unlabeled.
Yeah. The first time I heard a Carl Tatz Phantom Focus mix room featuring his PFM HD 1000 series monitors, I was completely blown away. It was like listening to three-dimensional sound with rock-solid bass all the way down to 20 hertz. It was really incredible. What's amazing is that a Phantom Focus system can be implemented in your existing control room or even bedroom studio, giving you world-class sound for mixing. Go see how cool your studio could look and sound at phantomfocus.com. So here you are in studios, you're learning how to make records. You're working with some big people. Obviously that one story of recording with Lou Reed and getting the blame for that record was a story of getting in trouble in the studio.
Relentlessly offensive.
Yeah, relentlessly offensive. That sounds like another band name.
It was a great friend. I got to give Clive Davis credit for coming up with that.
Share another story about getting in trouble in the studio.
Okay, I was doing a record one time. This had to be like 1975. And it was Roy Buchanan and Stanley Clark. And
funky.
Well, I shouldn't say anything about Stanley. He's still alive. Roy was they were not in very good shape. How do we put this? And so we spent pretty much the whole day, the frustrating day, mixing the cue, which of course was constantly changing because everybody was changing stuff. So at one point, we were using big red speakers, which were on stands in front of the console. And then somewhere along later in the day, in my frustration, I was going in front of the console and I tripped over a wire and I put the speaker through the control room window.
Whoa.
And that was the end of that session.
I've only heard of stories of rumors of other engineers putting things through the control room window, but
this was inadvertent, though. This wasn't out of anger or anything. I just tripped over it.
Oh, wow. So that must have been the end of the session, I guess.
Yeah, and it was one of those. Once again, it was one of those dates. They had only booked one day to do. Well, it wasn't like they were doing an album. It was just a one-day booking.
Wow.
So,
well, thank you. That makes us all feel a whole lot better about our next mistake.
There you go.
Let's see. What do you want to talk about next? I mean, we're just blazing through. You've got so many stories. Obviously, you've told these stories before. They're ready to go.
Well, I mean, I have a fairly good memory, but I was looking at your notes. Oh, yeah. You saying, what's your inspirational quote?
Yeah.
Well, two things. One, a lot of people like to complicate the recording. Let's try this mic preamp with that microphone and then do it with this impedance with something else, which is, you're just in the way. What you want to do, if let's say you have a singer and you want to record the vocal, come on. You're looking for a performance. You're not looking for, if you have a great microphone, great, but you don't have to go through these ruminations because all it does is spoil the mood and make everybody irritated. My motto is get home early.
Yeah. Get home early so you can listen to the records you make.
Yeah, or eat dinner or whatever. But so many people these days get in the way of the process of recording. If you have one of the things I'm totally against is having flavors in your studio. Let's have 3 API preamps and a couple of Neves and something else and something else. That way, when you go to record a set of drums, halfway across, you can have to change the preamps. It's like,
right.
What you really want is you want a console where all the preamps are the same. Now, I don't care if it's an API or one of mine or a Neve or whatever it is. You just want a good console, has good preamps, and get the equipment out of the way. All this nonsense of flavors and makes me crazy.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, the more we let the tools become invisible in our process, the sooner we start making creative decisions with things too.
And the engineer should be invisible.
Yeah. Yeah. Except for here. We get to be visible on this podcast.
Yeah. It's not your place to interfere with the recording process. You're there to get it on tape and make it sound good. And in my case, try and do it as quickly as possible.
Yeah. I mean, that was a quote from Richard Dodd too, when he was on the shows. He said like his biggest lesson was just trying to get out of the way of the music.
Yeah. Listen, when I did a lot of records and I did a lot of bands and, all that, move the guitar amp 3 feet to the left and put on 2 different mics. But a tremendous amount of what I did in the studio was commercial and film score recording, where you have a 10 o'clock session and you have 40 guys in the room, and 11 o'clock, they're gone. And you have to have 3.5, 4, or 5 minutes of music on tape. You don't have time to fuck around. You have to know what you're doing, and you have to be totally prepared about where you're going to put those things on the tracks. There's no, let's fiddle with the bass drum sound,
Yeah.
Guys paying, with those musicians, he's paying $5,000 an hour,
Yeah, indeed.
And,
go ahead.
And they want it done quickly, and they want it done right. And there were a few guys in New York we could do that, me, Elliot Shiner, Gary Chester. There were a few guys who really could haul ass in the studio and make things sound good.
Well, I think there's a lot of fun to be had when you learn how to be very efficient in the studio and work quickly. I personally prefer to work quickly in the studio if I can. I kind of hate getting bogged down with tweakiness, especially in the computer, when you're having to just mouse around all the time. I like making decisions quickly, going for a first take. If the band's going to play, just give it your best. Try and nail it, everybody, all at once if you can.
And I get in a lot of trouble for saying this, but Pro Tools is a very powerful editor. It's a terrible recorder. Why? Because you have to look at it. It's like the bitchy girlfriend who always wants attention. It's like if you have a console in front of you, you have a tape machine, and even radar where you have a proper remote.
Yeah.
I mean, I can sit and do vocal overdubs in the dark, and I can put my hands on the right buttons on the Studer 827. The Pro Tools and all those things as a recorder, and the other thing is, you will make some adjustment, and then suddenly you'll see the little peak go up in the thing, and instead of listening, you listen with your ears, not with your eyes. You shouldn't be looking at these waveforms when you're recording. That is just the most constantly unproductive thing you could do.
So that's not new to computers either, though. I mean, I feel like I've heard stories about people in the studio pre-computer talking about quit looking at the meters, forget the freaking meters, put tape over the meters, just listen to the sounds.
Yeah, I mean, that's true to a certain extent. I mean, meters are quite useful,
Well, for alignment and for getting things right, but at that decision-making time, right? You want to just use your ears.
Well, you have to know how to use meters. For instance, if you have 6 violins, you don't care if it goes to +3. If you have a snare drum, you probably want it at -3. There's no hard and fast rule, but it's a very fast visual representation of what's going on. You can glance at 32 meters and see what's going on very quickly, which is one of the reasons why I like moving fader automation.
Mm-hmm.
Moving fader automation gives you a tremendous visual feedback of what's going on. Like you could just out of the corner of your eye, you can see that number 34 flipping. It's like, why is that doing that? Or if you want to raise the level, you just reach over and grab the fader. More than its audio function, it's such a terrific graphic representation of what you're doing. You can just stand back and watch it go.
Yeah, that's cool to hear you say that because, with tools that can even digitally give you faders for a computer system, it's one other way to kind of quit looking at the screen. And I hadn't thought of that. I thought about grabbing a fader and being able to move it, but I hadn't thought about how visually it's letting you know what's happening on different faders.
Especially if you have a big console. Like if you're using like they used to use those Mackie things as for faders in Pro Tools, but you only got 8 of them because you had to skip. What's the word I'm looking for?
You had to page between different.
Them.
Yeah,
you have to page them, but you don't get to see all of them at once. When you can sit back 3 feet and see all the faders at once moving, boy, you get a real feeling of what's going on.
Very cool. Very cool. The STX 100D from the Spectra 1964 Custom Shop is the big brother to the now famous STX 100. A fully discrete mic pre with dual transformer isolated Spectra 101 amplifiers, the STX100D is exactly the same original circuit found in Stax, Ardent, AdVision, A&M, and Record Plant recording consoles. The sonic performance is identical. Best of all, it will plug into a single space of your standard 500 lunchbox. And if you want to add the sound of the famous Spectra C610 complementer, then check out the new STX600 modules, combining the STX100 mic pre and C610 complementer in a single 500 module. Now you can get that same incredible sound in your studio that worked for famous producers like Tom Dowd with the STX mic pre's, BBDI, and complementers. Go to Spectra1964.com or call 801-797-0642. One of the challenges for recording your voice is getting close enough to the microphone that you get a great bass boost proximity effect without getting blasts of wind on the microphone. Try this experiment. Hold your hand in front of your mouth and say, peanut butter popcorn. Feel that blast of air on your hand? That will cause a terrible sound on your microphone called a plosive. My favorite way to avoid this is to use the JZ microphone pop filter in front of a mic. This thing is built like a tank with a flexible metal arm that I can clamp directly onto the mic stand. It has a super cool waveguide design that looks like ripples on water and prevents the plosives getting through to the mic no matter how explosive the voice gets. Plus, it lets the high frequencies through for superb clarity on the mic. Get your vocals just right and use the limited time coupon ROCKSTARS to get 20% off the amazing pop filter at jzmic.com. Hey Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Geoff Daking, joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. Geoff, shall we jam? Shall we rock? Shall we continue jamming?
Let's do it.
Tell us about Dayking Audio. At some point you decided to start building gear.
Okay, so up until the middle 80s, if you wanted to make a record or you wanted to do anything, you had to have a credit reference, you had to go to a studio, you had to book time, you had to pay $175 to $300 an hour to do it. Then we got the computers. And let's see, what was the first real digital? Was Digital Performer, I think. That was the first one that really recorded. Mm-hmm. Then people got into that. And then a lot of the guys that I work with bought this thing called the Akai 12-track, which was a little console that had 12 inputs, and it had a VHS cassette in it and would record 12 tracks. So people started doing stuff at home, and then we got all these little independent studios, people doing things at home, but they sounded like crap. So because I had a studio, people would come to me and say, what do I do to make my stuff sound better? Well, back then, there were only 2 or 3 people making mic preamps. For instance, Neve wouldn't sell you a mic preamp. They would not sell you a channel amplifier. They said, we're not in the parts business.
Wow.
API, Paul Wolf and API had some. Demeter had one. So anyway, I was sitting around talking with the guys one day, and they said, what's the best sounding console you ever heard? And they all said the Trident A-Range. So I called up my friend Phil Wagner, who was at the time president of Trident USA. And I said, why don't you guys make these A-Range modules again? Because a lot of people would buy them for their home studios. He said, Trident has no interest in making that stuff again. They want to do these. They were doing a thing called the Vector at the time. And they just want to do these computerized consoles. They don't want to. He said, why don't you do it? And they sold me the schematic for $50.
Wow.
And I bought
for the Trident A-Range?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I borrowed a module from Lenny Kravitz and reverse engineered it. And that has been the core of everything we make, the same mic pre and the same equalizer. And everything else we do after that is original.
Yeah.
That's the core. That's the core of it.
And I think one of the things you used to describe it is Class A design, right?
Well, those original units were entirely Class A. They're all single voltage, Class A amplifiers, transformers in and out, which the Trident was not transformer out, not the module anyway.
Can you give us an introduction to the concept of Class A for sort of non-electrical engineers?
Probably not. It's sort of a buzzword. Basically, Class A consoles, the big difference between Class A consoles and modern consoles is that they don't use integrated circuits, which means they don't have a bipolar power supply. You have a voltage, which in my case is 48, and ground. In the case of a Neve, it's 24 and ground. Now, once you go into IC op amps, they're bipolar, plus and minus 15. And where the signal crosses through the 0 points, you get what's called crossover distortion. The Class A amplifiers, they have much more current. They drive transformers, But the real technical difference is you don't have what's called crossover distortion.
Yeah, and Rockstars, stop me if I'm wrong about this in my interpretation, Geoff, but a way to interpret that is when we do look at our computer screens and you see that line in the middle of your track and the waveform is positive and then going negative, that center line would be the 0 crossing happening in the circuit design.
Correct.
But in a Class A design, it's as if you lifted that whole waveform above the 0 line and it never had to cross over that. And so it was all just sort of free and clear.
Right. Electrically, of course, that's not what happens in Pro Tools.
Right.
It looks like anything else there.
Right. Exactly. Electrically speaking. Okay, cool. You mentioned transformers. I think I've heard you talking about how important they are as well. And, things like impedance matching. And I remember reading in the Abbey Road book at one point that everything was like matched 200 ohms everywhere. And I don't know if that's relevant or not, but tell us about transformers and why that matters.
Okay, so in my opinion, a mic, it's not a mic pre if it doesn't have an input transformer. There are a lot of differential ones. George Massenburg made them. A lot of people make them. The input transformer properly matched makes everything work well. For instance, you're talking about 200 ohms. Most quality, especially older condenser microphones have an output transformer. And that transformer is intended to be terminated in basically 1500 ohms. Now, if it isn't 1500 ohms, then the microphone will sound different, which is a problem. Especially, you ever see the people when they say, oh, I pushed the pad button, but it made the microphone sound different.
Right. Yep.
Well, that's because when they pushed the pad, it didn't maintain the same impedance as when the pad was out. And so the microphone, I got a different load here. I'm going to sound different. Modern microphones, not so much because they're transformerless and they don't really care so much about the load impedance. But the mic transformer is a matching transformer. You also get round numbers, 20 dB of free gain, which means it's going to be 20 dB quieter. If you make a mic pre out of an IC, you're not going to get more than about 50 dB of gain, and it gets pretty squirrely around 50. In our stuff, we get 75 dB of gain, which means we can easily and cleanly do whispers on a ribbon microphone. You can't do that.
That's cool. And then when we're talking about the output of a microphone, even a Shure SM57 has a transformer output on it.
Yeah, and it's 200 ohms.
Oh, is it really? There you go.
Yeah, it's a 200 ohm output. And older microphones like the RCAs, 77s and 44s, those are 50 ohm output. And they really need to be matched up to something. You need to get some of that free gain because they're very low level.
So a 50 ohm output can still go into a 200 ohm input on a mic pre, and that's okay? Or you really want a mic pre input that's matched?
Into a 1500 ohm input.
Oh, 1500,
well, I mean,
sorry.
I think the old Neve modules, like the 10 and 73s and things, somewhere on the back had a switch that changed the input impedance from 50 to 200. Most people just left them at 200, for 200.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, groovy. So do transformers find their way into a lot of the Dayking stuff?
Yeah, everything up until the mic pre 1 was all transformer in and out. Then we started using differential outputs on some of the stuff. If I had to push 1,000 feet of wire, let's say I was doing a remote job or a concert or something like that, you definitely want a transformer because the likelihood of getting a ground loop is remote. In the stuff where you're just using it within a studio, there are actually some advantages in using differential amplifiers. We use really good ones made by that corp. And they actually go lower. Okay, so there's not really much useful below 20 hertz. There probably isn't anything useful below 20 hertz. The differential amplifiers will go flat down to as low as we can measure it, which is 10 hertz. So let's put this in perspective. If you're recording at 15 IPS, no, 30 IPS on tape, you don't get anything below 40 hertz. Low E on a bass is 42 and a half hertz. So I should now want to drift into my high pass filter rap.
That's okay. We love it.
Because when you were recording in a large studio, which had good isolation and big speakers that you could hear the low end, and then the tape was protecting you below 40 hertz. Now you're recording, at home with little speakers and digital, which will happily go to 10 hertz. And you don't notice that the UPS truck is going by outside. Right. And so you end up with a lot of mud and crap in the bottom of your digital recording you don't even know is there. And that stuff takes up a lot of space and a lot of energy, which is why we make everything we make now. All the newer products have these adjustable high pass filters. So the differential output will go to 10 hertz. Is that doing you any good? I don't know.
I saw that. I think I was looking at a video of one of your consoles, and right next to the mic pre was a high-passing, adjustable high-pass.
Right.
Which I thought was kind of brilliant, because that is one of those things I love having. That's the first thing I reach for with the sound.
It's 12 dB per octave. Goes from 10 hertz to 200 hertz.
Yeah. And, it's a good reminder that when we recorded on tape, the tape gave us a natural high-pass filter, so you didn't have to make those decisions. It's why, low end has shifted on record making in a huge way between stuff that was made on tape and stuff that's all made in the computer now, especially with all this bass music that's coming out too.
Yeah, well, that's a style thing, but I'm not even sure how. I don't make those records, so I don't really know. But I would say that there's not much useful down there anyway. It's funny. A couple of the people who mentored me was, for whatever reason, when I first started off engineering after a couple of years, I got called by Phil Ramone to do a record up at Bearsville with Peter Yarrow, with Peter, Paul, and Mary. And one of the things he taught me was never EQ the bass at the fundamental. Always EQ it up an octave. If you're looking for the low end of a bass, do it at 80. Do it at 90 or 100. Because there's no usable energy down there. And nobody has stereos or anything that will actually reproduce that, or car speakers. Mm-hmm. You need the impression of it being, unless of course you're going to have, 1,000-watt subwoofer from the trunk of your car or something. There's no reason to do that because nobody can reproduce it anyway, and it's likely to just cause trouble.
Yeah, I mean, that's cool. And it's one of those things that's tough to learn at first is, you think, I want more low end in this. I want more bass. And you reach for the lowest frequencies and start boosting it. And then it doesn't sound the way you hoped it would.
The wrong spot.
Yeah. So go an octave above and start there.
That was Phil's trick.
Cool. And then I guess we can always just refer to a chart if we need to know what the fundamental of a bass guitar is. Do you know off the top of your head some of the fundamentals of different instruments just from your studies?
Well, middle A is 440. Mm-hmm. So the next A down is 220. The next one down is 110. It's not too hard. The next one down from that is 55.
What's the E string on a bass guitar?
42 and a half.
42 and a half. There you go. And then I guess a kick drum just goes as low as it wants to.
Yes, because that's an impact. But then again, how do you put that on tape? How do you, I think for me, the best bass drum sound I ever heard put on tape was Ed Cherney on those Bonnie Raitt records. That's a classic, great sounding low end record.
Nice.
Fantastic.
Nice. So I have to say, you had some really cool records in your playlist. Whole bunch of stuff, but let me ask you about a couple. Sylvia St. James, Black Diamond, super funky drums, great sounding drums. What's the story with that?
You've actually heard that record?
Yeah, but we put it in the Spotify playlist. Yeah,
that was Lenny White was the drummer.
Okay, cool. And was one of the ones that you recorded?
Sylvia St. James, yeah.
Yeah.
I did that one from beginning to end. I didn't mix that record, but I recorded the whole thing in New York.
It sounds so great, man. So great.
Yeah, he's a good drummer, Lenny White.
What, if we wanted to, short of hiring Lenny White, if we wanted to try and recreate a sound like that, a drum sound like that, what would be some of the first things you would try, as far as what you remember about the way you would mic a drum kit back then?
First of all, you tune the drums. You can do whatever you want. If the drums don't sound good in the room, they're always going to sound like crap on the tape. I don't care what microphones or who plays it. The other thing you got to remember is that when you get the drums perfectly tuned, you get 5 different drummers, and they're going to sound 5 different ways. It's all in the way, as they used to say with Ringo, it's all in the way he hits them.
Yeah.
So you got that going for you. I am not a proponent of a lot of mics. I never put a mic on the bottom of a snare drum. I have very specific mics that I like for things. I never mic the hi-hat. I put a mic on the hi-hat because the guy wants to see it there. I never turn it on.
Yeah.
On the snare drum, I like a KM84, a real KM84, or a Gefell little M300. I like large diaphragm condensers on the tom-toms, or RE20s, but large diaphragm condenser mics. I like in the bass drum, like an RE20 and a pair of decent overheads. I'll tell you a story. I was doing a commercial, strangely enough, for Pepsi-Cola with Buddy Rich's big band.
Yeah, we probably have that in the YouTube playlist.
No, I can't find it anywhere.
Okay, all right.
I can't find this thing anywhere.
We do have one from Pepsi that you shared with us.
Yeah, that was a typical one. But anyway, so I show up at the studio about 9:30, and then Buddy comes in. He comes in early. And I didn't know what he wanted, so his drums were set up in the middle of the room, and I had a mic on each tom-tom and a couple of overheads and a snare mic. And he hit, Buddy was legendary for his temper. He hit the roof. I said, listen, you preach to the choir. We'll do it with a snare, a bass drum, and 2 overheads. I'll just take all this crap away. And he loved that. So anyway, we're sitting there talking about drummers. And I said, well, what do you think of these rock and roll drummers? And he goes, they're all crap. He said, the only one who's any good is that Gad kid. He's pretty good. He said, well, what about somebody like John Bonham? And he sat down at the drums, and for about 40 seconds, he played exactly like John Bonham. And he said, anybody can do that.
Wow. Yeah, Buddy Rich was legendary. There used to be some really great bus tapes floating around Nashville that I got to hear every once in a while.
The other thing was he didn't read music. He had played in a big band. He couldn't read music. So, for instance, on that Pepsi tape, to get the whole band there, and they run the thing down without drums. And he sat there with his drumsticks kind of like against his head, and his eyes are closed, and he's looking at the snare drum. And he just listens to the arrangement once, and then he plays it.
Wow.
And that was probably like 2 takes.
Yeah, well,
one for the trumpet player.
Didn't want to. That's probably one of those sessions where if he's going to have to do a 3rd and a 4th take because of you, you're in trouble.
Oh yeah.
Share a story of one of the sessions you did where you just felt like everything. You were like, this is it. I nailed it.
Well,
if it's all of them, that's fine.
No, it wasn't everything. No, there were definitely some.
Maybe an early one.
Actually, the most fun album I ever did is one of the most obscure. One of those things is on the playlist. It was a disco record called. The guy's name was D.C. LaRue. And one of the things, it was the guy who arranged it and produced it was a brilliant guy. We started off with a click track, and we recorded an entire Arab band with the qanun and the dumbeks and the clarinets and all that stuff. It was just this band playing this Arab music with the real guys. And then we overdubbed, then we recorded, I should say, the disco track. And then we flew in the Arab band in places where we wanted it. And The guy's not a very good singer, but it was a very interesting record. It was a lot of fun to make that whole album. We did a lot of unusual things. We had a lot of fun. And, a lot of times you're just doing, two guitars, bass, drums, piano, and ho-hum. But this was really entertaining. And that's on the list. I forget what the name of the song is.
The Envoy Pro Electron is the fastest, toughest, mini-sized, universal portable USB-C SSD that lets you record from anywhere in the galaxy with confidence. With speeds of up to more than a gigabyte per second real-world performance, the OWC Envoy Pro Electron gives you high-speed audio data for recording and playback. Take your sessions and sample libraries with you anywhere you go. Built for reliability, the OWC Envoy Pro Electron is waterproof, dustproof, and crushproof. Never worry about the storage and safety of your work again. Find the new OWC Envoy Pro Electron and all your storage needs at macsales.com/rockstars. I love using iZotope plugins for my music and podcast productions. In fact, you're hearing Ozone and RX on my voice in this podcast episode. And now you can get access to all the iZotope plugins through the new subscription bundle. For only $19.99 per month, Music Production Suite Pro is designed for the serious recording, mixing, and mastering engineer, putting the finishing touches on music, film, and podcasts with fully pro versions of Ozone, RX, Neutron, Nectar, Neoverb, Tonal Balance Control, Visual Mixer, and more, including free plugin updates. And just for you, Rockstars, get an extended 30-day free trial subscription at iZotope.com/rockstars and use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off any individual plugin purchase. Coupon not valid for subscription. You mentioned piano. Piano is one of those instruments that can be very frustrating to record at first. What were some of your Well, I think sometimes I hear classic records from the era, that you were recording, and the piano just sounds so great, and it's bright enough to cut through, but it's also sort of like warm. And sometimes I'm just struggling trying to get that. And I wondered if you had any favorite ways you like to record a piano.
Well, if it's in the room with the band where you don't want a lot of leakage in the piano, then you're going to have on the low peg, and you're going to have a blanket over it. In which case, I would put two KM84s crossed right near the center of the piano. That makes a good piano set. It doesn't make a fantastic piano set because you need more room. If you have the option of having the piano in a room by itself, then you open the lid and you use a couple of large diaphragm condenser microphones, in the space.
Where would you put those large ones with the lid open? Would you open the lid like all the way and remove it, or never do that?
No, I never did that. That, God forbid you scratch it when you do that.
Oh, my piano's so scratched. I had to learn the hard way that the secret is a black Sharpie.
There you go. But yeah, you one near kind of the low end and one kind of near the high end, and
sort of looking in the opening as opposed to. Did you find yourself miking the hammers often?
Miking the hammers with the KM84s.
Okay.
When I'm doing that, those KM84s were right up by the hammers in crossed.
Okay, all right. So it's really trying to get the attack of the notes.
Well, see, the other thing is that piano is an interesting instrument because it goes very low, and that's not exactly what you want in pop music. Like, one of the things you don't want is like a concert grand piano. I think we always use a 5.6 Yamaha. 5.6 Yamaha was a pretty rich sounding piano, but it didn't have that much low end. Because first thing you're going to do in a rock and roll record with piano is take the low end out.
Right. Yeah. What is it? The C7 that gets used down in Nashville a whole lot.
That's a big piano.
Yeah. And it can be very bright, at least the ones I've heard. And I know that sometimes they would even shellac the hammers on the piano to make it even brighter.
Hammer hardener. That's an old trick to make it bright. But I don't like that personally. I like it when they take the picks, I like it. Sometimes they'll do the opposite of that. They'll soften the hammers. They take these little picks and
soften
the hammers.
Yeah. So you mentioned when you were talking about drum miking, doing just a decent pair of overheads. And
well, if you have Coles or something, then you're, a pair of 4038s, you're golden. Because then you really only need the snare and the bass drum mic.
And where would you put those? I mean, and would we have typically been in a fairly dead recording space? I mean, for the disco stuff, these are some pretty dead spaces for the drums, right?
Yes, largely they were very dead.
So this is just a pair of Coles sort of left and right, looking down over the hi-hat and looking down over the ride kind of thing?
They'd be together in a sort of a V shape, 90 degrees apart, kind of over the center of the drums.
Okay, you need a hell of a good mic stand for that too.
I usually mounted mic stands on the ceiling.
Oh, okay.
These were largely small drum booths. Well, relatively small drum booths. And I tried to keep the drum booths fairly live, with a hard floor as opposed to a carpet, and they were relatively live.
And then the walls would be the soft stuff?
Walls would be wooden absorbers. I used to make the absorbers out of cedar, and they'd be slotted, and then they'd be the thickness of a 2x4, 3.5 inches thick, and they would have insulation in it. And by spacing the slats in the front, you could decide whether they were going to be harder or softer by the gap in the slats.
Okay, cool. And then if we're hearing toms sort of panned left and right during a fill, is that the kind of thing that we hear as a result of those overheads, or were you also miking up the toms on it?
More than likely, the toms were mic'd, and I always do them pan them in the drummer's perspective, with the ride tom on the left.
Yeah,
a lot of people that think that's backwards, but that's the way I like it.
That's the way I've always liked it.
See, back to your analog situation. So even in 24-track, more than likely you'd had the bass drum on one track, the snare on another, and all the other drums and cymbals in stereo on 2 tracks, 4 tracks for drums.
Right. So you had to commit.
Yep. Now you can change some of that stuff with EQ, but yeah.
Well, so again, Sylvia St. James, and then the Herbie Mann record that I put in there, both of those have sort of crisp, dead drums that sound really cool. So how important was the EQ in that recording stage of the drums? Were you often EQing to
Always.
tape? Okay.
I never EQ, well, I wouldn't say never, but largely I commit all sounds to tape right away. The other thing that I always do is I always monitor through a compressor, because you're going to hear it that way anyway. And if you make it sound like a record when the guys come in to hear a playback and it sounds great, then they play better the next take.
Very cool. So I guess for those of us in our Pro Tools studios, we'd need to have an outboard compressor to be able to do something like that. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess we could hear latency, but they wouldn't want to hear that in their headphones. If you put well, no, an analog. I mean, my favorite compressor for that is the A&D Compex 760, which is one of the settings on all the compressors we make. It's a dual time constant compressor, where if it just hits it quickly and a little bit, it compresses one way, but when it hits it hard and long, it does something else. Oh, cool. Do you want to talk about some of the compressors you've designed at Dayking as well?
Sure. Well, the original one was it was originally called the 91579, then it was called the FET2. That's an all Class A transformer in and out compressor with switches on everything. That's presently discontinued. Then from there we went on. We made a stereo version of that, which is called the FET3, where except for the ratio, all of the adjustments are on pots. Some people like it better on switches. They like the repeatability. Some people go, oh, yeah, but what if you want to get it in the crack? Well, it's a battle you can't win. So The FET3 is essentially 2 of the old ones with continuously adjustable, and it's differential in and out.
Okay.
Now
cool.
we made a 500 compressor. And people loved the 500 compressor. The problem with the 500 series is you can't make any money. You got to make 100 modules of anything, and it takes a long time to sell it, especially equalizers. So we basically discontinued the whole 500 line. And we've just come out with a new compressor, which is essentially two, basically the same circuit as the 500 compressor, which is what we use in the console. And it's stereo, and it has VU meters, and it had linking and all that stuff. But it has basic controls. You can choose whether it's in or out, compressor limit, fast attack, slow attack, fast release, and that auto release, which is very similar to the Compex.
Yeah. And you said that's the same compressor that we find in the console channels?
Yes.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about the console. I mean, I included a video in the YouTube playlist where you sort of show it off. Or no, actually, it wasn't you. It was...
Thibodeau?
Yes. Yeah, Dave Thibodeau showing it off.
So the console is really two consoles in one. In one regard, it's a legacy console where the signal comes in, goes mic, pre-compressor, EQ, fader out to the buses. So you can assign the drums to 2 tracks or whatever, which of course is not the way that anybody records any longer. Then we have another thing that I call the one-button record mode, where it takes the output, it goes mic, pre-compressor, EQ, insert send, insert return, direct to your recorder. And the recorder comes back on the large fader for monitoring, and then that goes up to the buses where you can have a stereo mix, and you can use the 8 buses typically for personal cue. That way it's very simple to set up personal cue, multi-track things. And so that makes it really, and obviously you can flip between any of these modes and any modules.
And can you record a stereo mix of the drums while you're simultaneously recording directs of all the drums?
Sure.
Okay, cool. Shoot, what was I going to ask you? You're moving so quickly. So how about the EQ? I mean, what were the things that were important to you about having a really great EQ in a console?
One, that it not be parametric, it's not adjustable, because whenever you do that, it probably has a sweet spot somewhere, but largely you're sweeping around. It's just a marginalized equalizer. Basically, what you want to have is an equalizer with fixed EQ points, which are selected to be musical. I mean, look at my EQs, API, and Neve. They're all fixed frequencies. There's none of this Mackie parametric, let's sweep through the mid-range thing. Yeah, because it doesn't really work.
Because you're going to end up at the ideal spot, hopefully, if you're lucky.
Yeah, well, it also gives you too many options.
Yeah. We need less options, don't we?
You need fewer options. If you want to get home early, just have a console that sounds good, EQ points that sound good, and don't get bogged down in the technical parts of it. Oh, let's tweak the tom-toms.
I noticed that you also have a switch where you can sort of zero the fader so that you can do recalls from a computer, for example, right?
Yeah, I called Joe Ciccarelli one day. I said, "You mind if I drop by the studio?" He says, No, come on by. The assistant is zeroing the console. So they had a mix that they had done probably on a laptop on a plane or something, but he was spitting this mix out through probably 24 I/O. So they had to take a tone and they had to set each fader to be equal to the output of Pro Tools. I said, that's silly. I just put a switch on and we have a trimmer. So when you get it from the factory, the fader is set to 0. And you just flip that switch and the fader is out.
Right. So it makes it easy. Because I've done trying to zero faders out with the tone thing before, and it is a pain in the ass.
Tedious at best.
And if you so happen to be in any sort of an intermittent situation, then you also find yourself halfway through a long mix going, shit, is that still at 0 or did that get bumped?
Yeah.
So, but that's a cool addition. What are some of the things that you see, like where are we headed with audio design? Where would you like to go with design?
I'd like to make a smaller console that people could have. I'd like to compete in the range. See, it'd be difficult to do because all the mid-range stuff is made in China and it's very inexpensive. But I'd like to get in that, $20,000 to $30,000 range where you have, 8 inputs or something, and a really solid sounding console that people could afford to put in at home.
Yeah.
The big consoles, there are a lot of sticker shock on the big consoles.
Right. Right now you're 16 and up, 16 to 80, is that right?
In this version, we've never built one larger than 48.
Okay.
The very original one, we had an 80.
Okay. Anything else you want to tell us about the console right now before we move on?
No, it just sounds great. It's very easy. It's very intuitive. It's a great console for teaching because all the stuff we do, the signal path is straightforward and very logical.
Yeah. Here's a question. Can we take the high frequency and just crank it all the way up?
Sure. Why would you do it? Yes, you could. You better have some headroom because all the equalizers boost plus 17.
Wow.
So you better make sure that you have your gain structure right because you take things, if you're already at plus 10, let's say, and you want to crank it up plus 17, well, your DAW is going to shit the bed.
Nice. And I think I noticed that you also have a low pass filter in the
We do, but that's fixed.
That's fixed? Yeah,
we just don't have room for another knob there.
Would that be a useful move to boost the highs but hit the low pass at the same time and sculpt your sound that way?
Sure, because the high and the low in that equalizer are shelving and the mid ranges are peaking. So if you boost in the high end and then put the low pass filter on, essentially you've made it into a peaking equalizer.
Okay. And then same thing for the lows. If we boost the lows and then scoot up the high pass filter, what happens with that kind of an EQ combo?
Well, then you get the sound of the bass without overloading the low end. That's the Phil Ramone. That's the Phil Ramone thing where if you're trying to record a bass, and you want it to be punchy, then why are you allowing the undertones of 20 hertz in there? Get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's going to hear that. Nobody's going to hear that on their iPhone.
So filter out the low lows, but can you then go up to 100 hertz and use a shelf, or would you want to go up to 100 hertz and use a bell curve?
You'd be talking about a peaking equalizer, right? I think our peaking equalizer starts at 125. Yeah. These are sort of all subjective questions that you can't really answer because it all depends on the music and the instrument who's playing.
Cool. Good answer.
One of the things that my distributor audience wanted me to do is what Mackie does. They wanted me to come up with predetermined settings for instruments. And I go, no, how could I possibly do that? That's like the worst idea I've ever seen. A lot of people do it, but
yeah. What about sort of fundamentals of amplifier design and stuff like that? Do you see any major changes coming in audio amplifier design, or have the core elements been figured out with you guys designing great equipment for so long?
I think the core elements are pretty well figured out. You got to remember most of audio design was done by the telephone company in the 20s and 30s. That's where all our standards come from. We know basically what level your DAW is going to take plus 20. Even the differential amplifiers we have will put out plus 25. The ones with transformers will put out plus 32. Headroom is the trick. You got to make sure that the thing never runs out of headroom.
Yeah.
Especially in the summing.
Because then things start to not sound so good.
Well, the mixes get blurry.
Yeah. Okay, let me ask you a couple of questions about some of the records again. There was another artist in your playlist, Herth Martinez, Valley of the Music. Super groovy stuff. Can you share a story about that record?
No.
Okay. Right.
I don't remember doing it.
Okay.
And it's funny. There are a lot of records that I did make that aren't on those lists, like the Meatloaf record. And there's some records that I'm suspicious that I didn't do.
Yeah.
For instance, I know I'm credited for doing that Shamik Farrar record. I may have done some of it, but I was largely done by somebody else.
Well, so Meatloaf, Bad Out of Hell, that was one of the records you did, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's a very interesting record.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Okay, so that bass, drums, and the guitar track were recorded by Todd Rundgren at home at his little studio up near near Bearsville. It came down on 16 track, just those three instruments. Then I bumped it up to 24 track and did all the other recording. Now, they didn't have a deal. That was all done. I don't know who paid for it, whether it was Jim Steinman. I don't know who paid for it, but anyway. So Todd and I record in the same way, in that, like we said, we print everything on tape the way we want to hear it in the end, and none of this we'll EQ it later business. Mm-hmm. So they wanted to show the record companies how organic the record was. So we edited we basically sequenced the album into two-inch reels. And we put, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 seconds a leader in each song. And then Todd and I would sit there. So we had, 20 fingers, 24 track. And we would play these 2-inch tapes from beginning to end with the record company guys sitting up front, mixing this entire album live. We made some notes in the console. We had some tape, but largely we mixed it live. And that album, except for Love by the Dashboard Lights, which was mixed again by someone, that album was entirely mixed in an afternoon.
Wow.
From beginning to end.
That's a good feeling.
Especially when it sold, the initial sales were 44 million.
Good Lord.
I don't know how many records that thing has sold over the years.
Rockstars, I am super excited to announce that I'm doing a full studio remodeling here at the Toy Box Studio, headquarters of Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm working with the amazing studio designer Carl Tatz to upgrade my control room to a Phantom Focus mix room, and have also been improving the sound of my entire studio room by room. The first time I heard one of Carl's Phantom Focus mix rooms featuring the PFM HD 1000 series monitors, I was completely blown away. It felt like I was listening to three-dimensional sound where I could close my eyes and reach out and touch the instruments, with crystal clear bass radiating from a 50-foot wall of pure marble. It was by far the best sounding mix room monitors I have ever heard anywhere. Check out my complete interview with Carl Tatz on episode 50 of the podcast and discover the secret to massively improving your monitor setup at carltatzdesign.com/mixroom-mentor. What do you think you love most about recording, and in that time of making records, what was your favorite thing about it?
It's funny. In about 1997, I went to the movies in New York with my wife, and we went to see Jackie Brown, the Quentin Tarantino movie.
Yeah.
And Pam Grier's walking through the airport. And they're playing this music, and I go, damn, this music sounds familiar. Then I realized that I recorded it in 1972.
Wow.
And that was across 110th Street. I think the drums and bass and guitar were done in Philadelphia, and I did the rest of it. Bobby Womack.
Oh, yeah, the Bobby Womack record. That's in our playlist, too. Then, so that was actually recorded right there in the neighborhood where you were watching the movie?
Yeah, that was on 48th Street, and I watched it on 105th Street or something. Not quite 110th Street.
And so for you, like, what was your favorite thing about making records?
Well, to a great extent, it was working with people who had been my mentors and whose music I loved. Like one of the records I loved when I was a kid, I loved a band called Hank Ballard and the Midnighters, who made great records. And, Hank Ballard wrote The Twist, but he wrote a lot of great songs. And then one day I walk in and I'm making a record with Hank Ballard.
Yeah.
And
do you remember what record it was?
No, something terrible. I think it was during the days of streaking. And I think it was some horror. It's not like all the records were good. Like, one of my greatest pride is that I became Tom Dowd's go-to boy in New York.
Oh, wow. Tell us about that. What were some things you remember learning from Tom?
He never put the bass or the bass drum down the middle. He always had them 3 dB left and right. And a lot of people would say, oh, no, but he never put the bass drum in the center.
Interesting. So just slightly panned.
Yeah. You know, he was also a brilliant recordist. He, one of the artists he produced originally for Atlantic was Aretha Franklin. And he did the sessions down in Muscle Shoals. And you know that song, You're No Good, Heartbreaker, You Lie, I Never Loved a Man the Way I Loved You.
Yep.
So she starts off, You're No Good, Heartbreaker. And after about 10 bars, the vocal is flatlined. It's just fucking totally distorted. I said, Tom, how'd you let that go? He said, well, that was a reference vocal, but she came out of the booth and her husband was there and took it personally and hit her in her mouth and broke all her teeth. And so that's what we had.
Good Lord. That's insane.
It was a reference vocal.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah.
Anything else you remember learning from Tom? I mean, he had done so many records. His
never eat in the studio.
Never eat in the studio.
He never ate in the studio. He would come, he had breakfast, he'd come at 10 o'clock. He would leave at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he would go to the brasserie across from the Waldorf, and he would have dinner.
He wouldn't eat from 10 a.m. to 2 a.m.?
He didn't ever eat in the studio.
Wow.
He'd have coffee or something to drink. He never ate food in the studio.
Do you think everybody should not eat food in the studio, or do you think the band probably should eat?
I don't know. I enjoyed all Atlantic Records buying a lot of Indian takeout for me. So
there you go.
You know, when you do those English bands, it's all Indian takeout. I love that. But he never ate.
That's awesome. Well, let me jump into some of our outro questions here. Unless there's anybody else that was sort of a mentor to you that you got to work with, you want to talk about? I mean, you probably worked with a ton of people, right?
Well, probably my most embarrassing moment was I was doing they said, tomorrow you're going to do a thing with Paul Butterfield. You're going to make a record with Paul Butterfield. The track was recorded up in Bearsville. Mm-hmm. Basic track. So now you got to remember, this is before internet or cell phones or anything. When tape was moved from one studio to another, it was sent by a messenger service. And messenger services were, you know, just some guy with a jacket and a hat, and he shows up. And so anyway, I'm sitting in the control room, and this little black guy walks in, hat and a little thing, and he's got a tape in his hand. And I said to him, do you want me to sign for that? And he said, no. And he sat down. He was the producer. It was Henry Glover.
Wow.
Henry Glover, who wrote Drown in My Own Tears.
Wow.
Nicest guy you ever met, but I was just like, oh boy.
Well, sometimes you got to stick your foot in your mouth all the way, right?
I did a session one time. So stereotyping, right? What do you think of when you think of Donny Hathaway? Think of R&B, right? Mm-hmm. Famous R&B songs. I just heard something on the movie the other night, Donny Hathaway and Roberta Flack. It was great. Anyway, they said, all right, tomorrow you're going to have Donny Hathaway. So nobody called in a setup, nothing, no information. So I set up for 2 guitars, bass, drums, piano, and organ. Who knows what's going to happen? None of that. It was like tuba and mellophonium and a harp and something else. I mean, it all went fine, but you know, I guess you don't always get what you expect.
No, you don't always get what you expect. And the rule that I think is consistent is the more you lock in a decision, the more likely it's going to be the first thing that needs to change on a session.
Yeah, like the drums with mics with Buddy Rich.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's like when I see my interns taping mics down onto the floor to look really impressive, I'm like, oh, don't do that. That's the first mic cable we're going to end up ripping up during the session.
And it's going to have that sticky crap all over it.
There you go.
That's the first thing that you have to teach when you're mentoring people in the recording studio is how to wind a mic cable. How to do what? How to wind up a mic cable so that you never put a crimp in it. That's the most important thing in recording.
We just did that. We just spent some time doing that. Now, the other part about winding a mic cable is I remember learning that if you do it right and you throw it out right, you'll have no knots in it. But if you toss the cable out wrong or you did it wrong, you'll get a whole series of knots in the cable.
Yeah, whenever you see the kid doing it between his thumb and his elbow, he's gone. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Where you're
exactly.
wrapping it up around your elbow between your thumb and forefinger and your elbow. Ugh.
Yeah. Well, no, now that you are supposed to do that with an extension cord though, right?
No, all wire has memory. Well, the problem now is that wire you buy now is, I don't know what's in it, but a good mic cable, you never want to kink it because you want it to always come off neatly and go up neatly. The first thing you teach the assistant engineer is how to wind the cables.
Yep. Have you figured out how to explain it verbally, or do you need to show it to us?
You have to show it to them because you have to do the thing where you twist your finger, where you put the natural curl back in the,
Yeah. Over, under.
Hey, I trained a lot of people in my recording, a lot of people who did really well. One of my mentees was Leanne Unger, who went on to record tons of things. Leonard Cohen and Laurie Anderson. She's a professor at Berkeley.
Wow.
Another guy who worked for me, Vince Caro, who is now the head of audio for Pixar.
Wow.
I had a lot of guys who worked for me as an assistant who ended up doing really well in audio.
That's cool.
And some who left audio.
That's a good feeling. I love helping to teach, and I love it makes me feel fantastic if one of my interns becomes an engineer that can kick my ass at something in the studio.
Well, see, what I used to do was I used to record these commercials, but we also had a production company, so I would sing on the commercials. So this was like engineers, assistant's big break day. Nichols, come on over here. You're going to engineer to do all the vocals. This guy who never sat behind a console in his life.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's having to record vocals with singers. And that was how I started him. I always got him doing vocals while I was singing.
Yeah. Throw him right in the hot seat.
Right in the hot seat. They all did that. And they all liked it. James Nichols has gone on to have a great career, and he runs that. I don't know, I'm pretty sure he still does it. He ran that Manhattan Center where they do all the big orchestral Broadway shows and stuff.
Do you remember just like completely breaking a sweat your first time in the hot seat in the studio?
Oh, yeah. Well, the time when I had all those Brazilian guys.
Yeah.
The very first day.
Yeah.
That was pretty wild.
All right. So let me ask you some of these sort of quick outro questions. When you started out in recording, what do you feel like might have been holding you back? Was there anything holding you back?
Just the skills. Just the skills you need to make it all run smoothly and quickly. Takes you a while to figure that out.
Yeah. How about some of the best advice you remember receiving, or any particular other mentors for you?
Well, there was Tom Dowd, but stay out of the way. Just don't make it complicated for the artist to perform.
Yeah. And do you feel like you had a better sense of that because you had been in the drummer's, spot in the studio before doing this?
Maybe.
Did you continue to play drums on a lot of recordings after the Blues Magoos?
No.
Okay.
I almost, except for a few commercials, I almost didn't play again for 25 years. Then I started playing again.
Yeah. Tell us about playing again, because we're all feeling that on a certain level.
Well, then let's see. Then the Blues Magoos. One of the things that held the Blues Magoos back in the 70s was that one of the guys in the band, the lead singer, had a full-time job. Believe it or not, this crazy bastard was in charge of quality control for the company that made the ingredients in birth control pills.
Whoa.
How we got that, I don't know. But anyway, once Ralph retired, then we started going out and touring again. And we went to Europe, and we do stuff around the States. We went to New Orleans. We did that stuff. And then one of my interests, when I was a kid, I grew up in Delaware, and I played in, you know what a juke joint is?
Yeah, I mean, I think of them down in like Mississippi and stuff down here.
Well, no, believe me, they were in Delaware and Maryland and Virginia too. Like, for instance, did you see the movie The Green Book?
I don't know if I saw
where the black guy and Vito Mortensen go around and they tour the Deep South. He's a gay piano player.
Okay.
So in the end of it, he ends up playing in a juke joint somewhere. Well, anyway, where I live in very, very rural Virginia, there is one of the last remaining juke joints. It's called the Dewdrop M. And they had been kind of inactive for almost a year. And so I said, well, we got to get this going again. So I put together a band, and we went down and we played the Dewdrop, and we packed the place, and we got it wound up again, and she's making money. And I'm glad to see it, but look it up it's D-O, not D-E-W.
Okay, all right, great.
It's a classic juke joint. And of course, the juke joints all suffered because they were built as restaurants and entertainment for Black people. But after integration, Black people can go anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like they can't go to a local restaurant or something now. So the need for places like the Dewdrop fell off, and they were no longer a full-time restaurant.
Wow.
So, but it's sort of been my cause to keep the Dewdrop going.
Yeah. When I think of juke joints, I think of like R.L. Burnside, and sounds like that down in the South.
Well, when I grew up in Delaware, down in southern Delaware, there was a place called the Rosedale Beach Hotel, which was a Black hotel, and it was on the water on Indian River. I don't think it had but 8 rooms or something, but it was a 2-story hotel. And out on the concrete pad on the beach side, they would have concerts every week. And I'm telling you, they had Count Basie. I saw Stevie Wonder there with the Marvelettes and the Jarmels.
Wow.
These bands, when they were playing DC or somewhere with a lot of money, then they would come over and play these little juke joints on, like on the Eastern Shore and suburban Maryland. You could see James Brown in an after hours club in Dover, Delaware.
That's wild.
The one that I played in when I was in high school was called Bus Johnson's Blue Ribbon. And we were the white guys who played at 7 o'clock. And then they had another band that came in.
Want to know how to record killer drums in your studio? Rockstars of Drums will show you how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with examples from Nashville session drummers in a Grammy-winning studio. Want to know how to master your own music at home? Rockstars of Mastering will show you how with plugins in your DAW so that your music will sound awesome when you finish your mixes. And if you're looking for a step-by-step solution for a pro mix that won't take years to learn, Ultimate Mixing Masterclass with Craig Alvin will show you a proven method for creating Grammy-winning quality mixes that you can apply in your home studio right now. Or if you just need to learn the fundamentals of a great mix, then register for my free course, Mixmaster Bundle, to get great mixes using simple, free plugins. Get started now making your best record ever at recordingstudiorockstars.com/academy. Use the code ROCKSTAR to get 10% off any course in the Academy for a limited time. Share with us a recording tip, hack, or secret sauce, something that the rock stars could use on their next session. Just anything that comes to mind that is a great tip for making records well.
When you have a singer who's having trouble staying in pitch, give them the bass, not the guitar, not the piano, and certainly never a synthesizer with FM synthesis. Secret to that is the singers sing to the bass. And if the bass is not in tune, they'll never be in tune.
Right. Because that's the fundamental.
But that's the thing that you need to give people in the phones when they're having trouble singing.
How about a favorite hardware tool, something physical that you really like having around the studio when you're making records?
You mean besides a tambourine?
Anything.
I just like a good compressor. I like one good compressor that I can use to keep in the monitor all of the time. Starting with basics, you always have a good compressor you're listening through.
Very cool. Jim Rondinelli was a producer engineer that I had a chance to work with one of the first records I did, and he did that. He had a Neve compressor in the stereo mix the entire time we were working, and I was really struck by that. But we were also on ADATs at the time, so that might have been part of it,
I use the A&D Compex because that has that very complicated attack and release thing. Mm-hmm. From an audio standpoint, it's kind of funky, but the Neve didn't have that. In my studio, I had a pair of 33609s and I had a pair of A&D Compacts, had LA two ways and all that kind of crap. But the Compex is the one that really is the one that gives the mix excitement. And that's what my compressors do.
And that your studio was Nimbus 9?
Yeah, later it was it was called Messina Music. I had, well, let's see, 3 in all. I had the one on 68th Street, and then later we took 2 5,000 square foot floors over on 45th Street, where we had, 4 studios. And then I sold off the floor below. We just had 3. And that one was the first API built in 15 years. Paul Wolf and I did that one. I had a Trident, and I had, before Pro Tools, it was called Sound Designer. And I had that. And I did a lot of remastering of records for RCA. One of the things people don't realize is that in the early 80s, there weren't a lot of records made because the record companies figured out they could make all the money they ever needed just by converting their library into CDs.
Right, that's right.
They could, I remember John Ingrassia told me one time, they could take any vinyl album and convert it into a CD and do a run for $5,000 and re-release it. And so they didn't bother making records. But anyway, in early 90s, when Dolby had Pro Logic, and that whole surround sound thing was coming around again, RCA, I remixed tons of stuff into Dolby Pro Logic for RCA records and remastered a lot of their classical records and Broadway shows and things like that. And it's funny because I borrowed the equipment to do this Pro Logic from Dolby. And Bob Warren, who was the head of that department, said, listen, do me a favor. I'm going to bring you this new thing because we're going to be coming out with a true multi-channel surround system, which of course was 5.1 later. And so we would set up these mixes in Pro Logic and then take a break for half an hour. This is all automated mixes. And I would run them again into 5 channels in, it was an ADAT. That was the multi-track recorder they used. And so I did all this original 5-channel recording for Dolby using material from RCA records. Cool. A lot of stuff went on. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you've seen some different formats come and go. You saw Quad make an appearance, right?
Well, see, the problem with Quad was they couldn't come up with a standard. There was a discrete Quad. There was that stuff where they had it on vinyl. The Quad was in the early 70s. And the second API console we ever had quad panners in it. And it was a quad mixing console. It's crazy. But that format never took off because nobody could ever come up with a standard. And I don't know, do you remember Denny Purcell, the mastering guy in Nashville?
Right, yeah.
The guy who died had whatever that was called. He said the reason that 5.1 will never succeed at home is because his brother-in-law will get 2 speakers in phase, and his wife will never let him have 5 in the living room. And it never really has succeeded.
Yeah.
Home 5.1.
Do you see new formats coming and having longevity because people have learned all the right lessons as far as making sure that they're coordinated in these efforts?
Well, I saw a lot of that quad stuff come and go because what was it? I forgot who said it. Elliot Shiner or somebody said, as soon as I hear, no, it wasn't Elliot. He said, as soon as I hear the music come from behind, I'm leaving the room.
Okay.
I think that these new formats like this Axios thing that Dolby is doing, which is pretty amazing,
Atmos,
Atmos.
Yeah.
Is to lure people into the theaters. Of course, that was a great idea last year. But, so many people are watching movies on TV now, and the Atmos isn't going to be much. I don't know. They're spending a lot of money on it. That's a new format.
We'll see. I mean, and I do think that we're going to see a shift to virtual reality and sort of, putting on goggles and seeing things in 3D and stuff. I just think.
What about the audio? How are you going to do the audio? And
I don't know.
9.1 or where that is.
I don't know if you'll have to, because it may just deliver it through headphones to you. My daughter got an Oculus Quest thing for Christmas, and I've had some experience playing it. It makes me dizzy in about 15 minutes. Actually, it'll make me dizzy in about 1 minute if I actually like move across a space and I didn't move my legs at the same time. I'm nauseous for the rest of the afternoon. But with that said, I think that stuff will get figured out. And the idea of being able to experience music and experience the space and even work that way it's intriguing, at least to me, you know.
There are a lot of people working on that. I have a good friend who's working on some very proprietary system with this sort of reality audio. It's very complicated. I don't even know what she's talking about half the time, but it's that will come out. Does it help?
We'll find out.
I mean, you know, I think it's interesting to hear the rockets come from behind and then go by your head and hit something in front. But other than that, I don't think it does much for music.
Yeah, I mean, music's a funny thing. Like, you know, people are making things where you can turn your head and the band sort of stays located in the space. But, you know, as we know, listening to music on even 2 speakers or 1 speaker is already pretty damn exciting if you do it well.
I like stereo. I think stereo was a great idea. It's way better than mono. I haven't really heard much beyond that. I think that in my last apartment, I had a little 5.1 thing for film. It was nice to have the audio coming out of the mono speaker in the middle. That was nice.
Yeah, it's good to hear voices.
And so to me, it's all that stuff is, I could be wrong, but I've never seen any of those formats succeed in the home.
Right. People like things simple.
Well, you can't have Atmos at home, you know. It's going to, you know, I mean, I suppose there's somebody who has it at home for some, you know, Jeff Bezos or somebody, but.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, even just setting up surround speakers, you know, people have enough trouble just setting up 2 speakers in their living room, let alone figuring out where to put all the rest of
and keeping them in phase.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so Geoff, I'm going to cycle to our closing question here. This one is hypothetical. We're going to take the Wayback Studio machine. You get to go back in time and find young Geoff tuning his drum heads and say, listen, dude, here's the single most important thing you need to know if you want to be a rock star of the recording studio one day. What advice would you go back and give yourself if you could?
Get home early.
Get home early.
You know?
Did you get home late for a while?
Oh man, I used to start at 9 o'clock in the morning and finish at 2 o'clock in the morning. Take a bus back to Princeton, get home at 3:30, get back start driving again 6:30. I would sleep 3 hours a day. I was working 105 hours a week.
Wow.
So
I guess it was too expensive to get an apartment at the studio.
My wife wouldn't have it.
There you go.
She wanted to live in the country.
There you go. That's a good
reason.
I
would have happily lived in New York in 1971, 75. My favorite part of New York was, you ever see the movie Taxi Driver?
Oh, yeah.
That's my New York.
Do you know Taxi Driver really well?
Pretty well, yeah.
Do you remember in the very, very, very end, he looks in the rearview mirror just before they end the whole thing?
Yeah, why? What was in it?
I don't know. I always wondered. I felt like it was important and meaningful. Something happened. He saw something in the rear view at the last split second.
Well, anyway, I commuted either by train or bus from 48th and Broadway back to essentially Princeton, New Jersey for 7 years. And so I passed through that area, that Travis Bickle part of New York, every day, twice a day.
Wow.
And I loved it. I did not like what I call the Disneyfication of Manhattan.
Yeah. Well, I was there from 68 to about 74, something like that, living in Brooklyn. And I definitely have memories of it. I loved it. I mean, I didn't have much to compare it to at 6 years old, but it was a cool place to grow up. Geoff, thank you so much for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. It's been an absolute blast hanging out with you, dude. I love hearing all your all your stories. You got so many great stories, man. Let the Rockstars know where they can go find you online. Where would you like them to go? What if they want to check out Dayking, your fantastic studio gear, or learn more about you?
It's tough. Dayking.com.
Okay. Easy to remember.
Tough. Yeah.
Rockstars, a reminder, we've got a playlist in the show notes. You can scroll down. We'll have a link to Dayking.com as well as, Spotify and YouTube and stuff. So please go listen to these cool ass records. Geoff, great to meet you, man.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks so much for joining us. Cheers.
All right.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio. Just look for the link in the show notes below. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our amazing sponsors who helped make this episode possible. OWC, Carl Tatz Design, Spectra 1964, Isotope, and JZ Microphones. Remember to use the coupon codes ROCK10 at isotope.com/rockstars for 10% off any plugin purchase, or use the coupon ROCKSTARS at jzmic.com for 20% off the pop filter for a limited time. And don't forget to learn how to get your monitoring just right at carltatzdesign.com/mixroom-mentor. And finally, use the coupon code ROCKSTAR for 10% off any course at Recording Studio Rockstars Academy for a limited time. We'll include all these links in our show notes. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio. They're going to help you make your best record ever. I would also like to thank our fantastic team here at Recording Studio Rockstars: Vlad Weselchenko, Braden Stremming, and John Richardson for additional podcast and video production. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.